we're on the highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. And he's completely right, apart from one thing. We don't have our foot on the accelerator. We are tied up and gagged and bound in the boot of the car, and the ruling class are driving it. So it's not just a question of like, oh, we need to collectively come together and take our foot off the accelerator and maybe change course a bit, et cetera, Like we have to find a way to cooperate, to untie ourselves and each other, burst through the back seat, force the driver out of the driving seat of the moving car, learn how to drive and not drive off the cliff.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is James Schneider. James is the Communications Director for Progressive International, the co-founder of the left-wing grassroots movement Momentum, and the author of Our Bloc, How We Win. James is also the former Director of Strategic Communications for Labour and Jeremy Corbyn. He joins me today to discuss the roots of the crises, explaining how they can be separated into three separate levels, each of which feeds the other, and how to differentiate between the crises which are a permanent feature of fossil capitalism, through social crises, up to modes of production and energy systems. James then explains that given fossil capitalism is cannibalising itself at this moment in history, how critical it is that the progressive movement unites across the different sub-movements to respond to the level 1 crises, energy use and energy rights. James gives a critique of reform versus revolution, explaining the problems with the Green New Deal and explaining what he describes as the communications catastrophe of degrowth. He explains the difference between intellectualization and political and social power, how to take ideas out of the academy and onto the streets. He explains his vision for a green democratic revolution, that we need an anti-regime campaign to overthrow the ruling class. And despite the immensity of this task, James remains hopeful, highlighting throughout the interview, they put so much effort into holding us down because they are not running the system well, because people know they are not running the system well, and because the vast majority of people around the world share socialist values, and the pressure of that movement, the people's movement, is building. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. James, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, why is the world in crisis and what can we do about it?
Well, I think there are three different types of crisis, and we need to keep all three of them in mind. Normally, we just focus on the first level of crisis, which I think we could call like system normal crisis. The system in which we live generates crisis for huge swathes of humanity. And that's a permanent feature. And that doesn't mean that the system as a whole is in crisis. In fact, it's a feature. So, whether that is environmental destruction in one place, the systematic undervaluing of certain types of work, the underpay of other types of work, killing people, all of these things, these different crises are normal to the system. And yes, they move around and they come into different formations, but that doesn't mean that there's a systemic crisis. Then there's a level up. You kind of zoom out from that type of crisis into crises within the social system as a whole. So these are not mere problems that affect some people, but they are crises in the reproduction of the social system. So that might mean that there are too many crises going on the first level, in the system normal level, which is breeding too much revolt that is disrupting the system. And this kind of second level, you can view that as things like class conflict or sometimes interstate conflict. This is the level that the Italian revolutionary theorist Antonio Gramsci was talking about when he said the crisis consists precisely of the fact that the old is dying and the new can't be born. That's talking about the social settlement, basically. And sometimes we focus on that level, and we're clearly in a crisis of that level as well. We don't have consent for the social system, the social settlement that we currently have. There is not broad-based support for it. And that's part of why we see political volatility, fracturing, and so on and so forth. And we don't have the kind of systemic leadership that you sometimes see, which can lead to expansion for some groups of people, enough people to actually improve their living standards, and the promise of improved living standards to enough other people to maintain a kind of stability. But we've actually got a deeper, bigger crisis. There's another thing, if you zoom out further, which is to do with the mode of production in our energy system. So, our crisis is not just that there are some issues in financialized capitalism, or that people don't trust elites, or that there's some other kind of challenge to the current social settlement. We have a deeper underlying problem that a massive driving force of the social system we've lived under for the last 200 years, which is basically fossil capitalism, is coming under intense strain because we are having to move from fossil fuels as the source of our economic expansion. And while we've had different social settlements at different times in history and in different countries, in the last 200 years, none of them has stepped outside of the essential expansionist logic of fossil capitalism. So you've had different distributions of wealth and of power within given societies over the past 200 years, but none have stepped out of that logic. Now, we are coming to a crunch, not yet primarily because of climate breakdown. Climate breakdown for perhaps 10, 15 years has started to put some mild upward pressure on prices, supply chains, and disruption, and that's starting to get much larger and non-linear, and will get projects to get much larger and much more non-linear as things go forward. But because of the limitation of fossil fuels themselves, there's about 45 years of oil and gas at current production levels in known reserves. Of course, we'll find more, but there is a crunch coming, and that isn't the crunch isn't just like you can switch from one type of energy system to another type of energy system. There isn't the infrastructure we've developed over the last 200 years, the infrastructure for a fossil capitalist system. And we don't have anything like approaching what would allow the continuing expansion under existing terms under any other type of energy system. So that's the basic contours of the crisis, and each one sits within the other one. So we have a whole set of crises which could be normal to the functioning of the system, but there are many more of them because the system isn't functioning properly. That's creating crises within the social settlement, but those can't be fundamentally resolved because the even larger issue, which is that the economic basis of the system, which has led to the most dramatic expansion of things over the last 200 years. I mean, if you look at global population, if you look at land use, if you look at material production, I mean, it's been gigantic, and that is what is coming under a question, and it's coming under question not because of not for kind of good reasons, not because it's being challenged from class or gender or decolonial positions, although of course there are those challenges, but it's on its own terms. It hasn't found a way to go beyond itself, to go beyond the essentially free inheritance that they had. Because if you look at history in the grander sweep, not just in the last 200 years, the other conditions for dramatic capitalist expansion have been present, which are great pools of mainly looted capital, wealth from other people, forced labor, and organized merchant power. I mean, that's existed in many, many societies, many times in history, but they haven't yielded basically self-propelling industrial production because those inputs haven't been connected to the other input, which is an incredible energy dense source, which has been fossil fuels. So I think that's the nature of the current crisis that we're in.
Thank you for that. There's a lot in there, and I'm sure we'll sort of go through each of these three layers in more detail throughout. Now, it seems almost silly to say, what do we do about it, as if there's like one solution, because obviously there isn't one solution. Any resilient ecosystem of action demands diversity. But from where you sit, your area of expertise, what do you think needs to be done?
So I think the first thing we have to do is recognize the scale of the issue, that we're not dealing with the areas that we normally do. And normally, progressive campaigns and movements respond to the crisis which is immediately in front of them, because that's the one that affects people. And those are very often normal system type crises. The role of progressive forces, progressive movements, the left, whatever you want to call it over the last 200 years, has been to try to unite those different revolts generated by system normal into a force that can generate and then hopefully resolve a crisis at the social settlement level in favor of reducing some of those crises that affect people. And we don't have at the moment very much force that does bring together different types of revolt against the existing order, which are separated by geography, language, issue, location in the economy, location in society, and so on. But even if we did have that thing, that's not enough, because we need to be dealing with the first order issues as well, which do come down to, which are both technical and political. The technical is fossil capitalism is, whether we like it or not, that regime is going away. That regime is changing. And currently is not changing led by anything good that is going to replace it. It's changing because it's failing on its own terms. So I think that has to be our starting point. So we need to focus on, yes, we need to unite the different struggles, but we need to focus them then in on the first order issues. So that is things like energy production, energy production, energy distribution, and who has rights and claims over energy. Then you get the next level down, which is production, both of food, products, services, and social reproduction, and fights over that. And these things necessarily need to be internationalized. Then the next question is about time frame. Because we've got models for change. There have been substantial advances that we've seen over the last 200 years within this larger system, within this larger regime of fossil capitalism. But generally speaking, they've taken quite a long time. So they have a kind of radical social democratic type logic, which is you combine mass movements and sometimes quick changes with reforms to institutional framework to get a better social settlement. And we've had good examples of that, but they've basically gone with the train of the system. So they say that the system is expanding. We want to modernize it further, but do it in a more rational way and socialize its returns. And you can see that from lots of different types of, of radical progressive change, from the Bolsheviks through European social democracy to the pink tide in Latin America. They all say, Lenin said, communism is Soviet power and the electrification of the whole system. It's basically modernize and socialize. European social democracy is capitalism if it's left to do its own thing, ends in the Great Depression and world wars. So we're going to manage capitalism in a more efficient Keynesian manner, and therefore we can socialize some of its returns. The pink tide in Latin America says we're getting nothing. We need to take the stage, modernize, build infrastructure, and have mass programs to redistribute wealth and power in favor of the majority. All did socializing in those directions, but none of them could step outside of the broader regime. So I think we have to start looking at things to do with very fast time frame and very profound change. Now that sounds kind of otherworldly and perhaps absurd from the perspective of where we are. But two things to counter that. I mean, firstly, we should be realistic. And to be realistic, we have to demand the nearly impossible, because the trend scenarios otherwise are profoundly terrible. And the other thing is, things look closed because we are only entering into the system breakdown period. And that will produce terrible threats, but also opportunities and openings. And so I think what we have to do now is we're basically, maybe the science will show this in 10 years' time or 50 years' time or whatever, but maybe 2023 is the year where, in terms of climate breakdown, we've entered non-linear breakdown. Things are jumping around much more. We've had gradual and bad changes, let's say, for the last 30 years. Now we're getting non-linear big jumps. And that's going to throw up some very weird things. So just to try to now hone that down into something more manageable. There are sort of two broad programs or ideas that deal with this, or that try to engage with this issue. They have pockets of support. One is the idea of a Green New Deal or a global Green New Deal, and the other one is degrowth. And I don't think that either of those work for different reasons. So Green New Deal has, although I would support a lot of the policies and the things within them, but as frameworks alone, I don't think I would. So Green New Deal proposes that through a transfer of investment, a certain percentage, 1.5%, 2% a year, basically not that much as a percentage of the global economy, we can build a green energy system to rapidly move away from fossil fuels, and doing so will require more state direction, more state involvement, and so that we can socialize that system. It basically follows the previous model, which is why it seems superficially attractive, because it builds an alliance between some workers, some bill payers, people concerned about the environment, and some capitalists who will benefit from owning this green infrastructure to make the changes. Now, the problem with that is, firstly, as your audience will not find surprising at all, you can't just unplug fossil fuels and plug in clean energy. There really is no such thing as straightforwardly renewable energy, because the stuff that goes into making solar panels, wind turbines, and so on, those things aren't renewable, and they're far more complicated processes than just extraction of fossil fuels, which is both in technical terms relatively easy, whereas building a wind turbine is extremely complicated. It requires huge amounts of incredibly complex supply chain, minerals from all over the world, various different industrial processes along the way. and we hadn't built the infrastructure, or even on things like steel, there is, you can electrify the production of steel and therefore make it potentially green if your electricity grid is mainly clean energy. But that isn't like you take out one part and you put in another part. You're building an entirely different production process. So the scale of what's required is much, much larger. And fundamentally, it isn't working anywhere. If you look at the most Green New Deal inflected policies currently on offer in the world, so you take the US with its imperial Inflation Reduction Act, friendshoring, nearshoring, all of that stuff. It can also happen while they simultaneously open the Willow oil field in Alaska. Mm-hmm. There's no reason why expanding investment into green energy can't go hand in hand with expansion of fossil fuels. Or the continuation of fossil fuels. And that the Green New Deal structure essentially leaves the political system and fundamental economic relations intact. And so while it's superficially attractive, and all of the individual policies within it, I would entirely support. Should we insulate homes? Yes, of course. Should we be building out public power for clean energy? Yes, of course. Should we have free or as close to free as possible public transportation? Should we be electrifying things? All of those things are absolutely the case. And should the jobs that come with it be green? And all of that stuff is, of course, correct. But it's insufficient because it's just really scratching the surface. Then at the other end, you have degrowth, which I think we have to get away from because without being too comsy about it, it's such bad comms. Right? Like going back to the analysis at the beginning with the crisis thing, like normal crisis in the system for most people is degrowth. Okay. Like most people's living standards don't rise. So it's divorced from the experience that most people have. In the UK, where we're speaking from, wages at the same level they were in 2005. Rents aren't, bills aren't, your groceries aren't, but your pay is. So, most people have been experiencing degrowth. That's the comms reason why it's bad.
Hang on, wait. I just want to jump in here very quickly and say most people are experiencing degrowth through the way that they are allowed to understand what degrowth is by a, sort of vapid policy lens in which any economic growth benefits everyone, which it doesn't, because we know that wealth doesn't trickle down. I mean, real degrowth in the way... I'm not saying it's good or bad comms. I'm just saying real degrowth in the way that the degrowth scholars talk about would also be a redistribution of resources.
Yeah, sure.
Which would benefit everyone.
So pick a different term.
Right.
Just for starters, let's go more into it. Right. So it's a terrible term. We should never use it ever again. Right. But also there's an intellectual element to it, which isn't quite right. The idea that because society says we're going for GDP growth, that we live under fossil capitalism. There's a kind of, like, if we measured different things, we'd have different outcomes. Which just isn't true. Like the underlying logic, the reason why things have to expand isn't because we are measuring expansion and therefore things have to expand. Like the words are describing the reality isn't bending to the words. So, why do we need to have economic expansion? Because there's $300 trillion of debt based on future expansion. So if we don't have future expansion, that's $300 trillion worth of debt, which isn't going to be repaid entirely, which means total financial crisis and so on and so forth, right? As in, it is baked into the system that it has to expand. It isn't based on the fact that we've got the wrong metric, because it expanded before we had GDP growth as a measure of expansion. And, for all the David Cameron saying, well, we should measure well-being as well, and it isn't really getting into the underlying dynamic of the system.
Okay, I hear you, and I like that. The words are trying to create reality, and reality is not bending. But when you go up a level of like economic thinking, do you not, and I'm probably betraying my total ignorance here, but is it not that nobody really expects debt to be paid off anyway? And that's part of the fallacy with its very existence, and why a lot of people are calling for like debt cancellation, for example.
So the debt has to be serviced, and the reason why the debt won't be cancelled, or when it is cancelled, it almost immediately comes back. There was some debt cancellation for some heavily indebted countries in the year 2000, and now 1 in 4 countries on earth can't service their debts. Of course, not all the debt will ever be paid back. That's not the point of it, but it has to be serviced along the way. So there have to be returns to it. Now, that can happen either through just massive monetary expansion, which is what we've been having, or it can happen because of underlying material expansion. Those are the two things. Then yes, people are calling for a debt jubilee, and yes, we should have a debt jubilee, and we're going to have to, part of any solution. We're talking. I'm trying to talk here about regime change, like bigger than social system, social settlement change, bigger than at a much larger level. So yes, all those things would have to happen, but they can't just happen. This is my other critique with a lot of the degrowth discourse. Again, very sympathetic to the basic thing about we need to have an economy that meets human needs within planetary boundaries. Right? That's it. That should be an incredibly obvious sentence that everybody can, that everyone can agree on. How you then construct a social system to deliver it, both in theory and then build the power to do so, is an entirely different matter, and it's not just a theoretical thing. You can't say, well, if we had an economy that we measured these things in these particular ways, you need to have the social power to force those that are in power to not carry on doing the things that they're doing. For example, we need to shut down fossil fuel production. That doesn't just happen because we get a nicer theory of how a balanced economy, or whatever we want to call it, will work. That requires a political strategy and social power, as well as technical plans for how to deliver it and how to deliver the alternative power that you're going to have to heat people's homes and keep people moving around and grow food.
Okay, hang on. Yes. So I want to definitely take this juncture and go down there, talking about political and social power, because I think we do see a lot of like intellectualization of the problem and people not really sure how to press and go, essentially. And it is like a big critique that is very easy for the right wing to weaponize. I just on this debt thing though, just very quickly, and I promise we won't stay here for very long because I understand that I can't learn everything about debt in the next 3 minutes. But
I also definitely couldn't teach you everything about it.
Blind leading blind, that's fine. Let's see where we go. Like if the global economy is expanding all of the time, and we are using this monetary expansion because of the amount of debt that exists, because debts have to be serviced, then why is the amount of debt continuously increasing too? Surely if that sort of strategy was either working or genuine, debts would gradually be getting paid off. But from what I understand, like nations are continuously in more and more debt.
Because to service the debt, that doesn't mean to pay it down. That means to pay the interest to the holder.
Just the interest.
So, and where debts are paid down, new debts are taken out. Mm-hmm. So, the debts are never going. The problem isn't that we have to pay off 300 trillion or else everything is doomed. It's not that. It's that the ongoing expansion has to, in the minds of investors, be related in some way to the returns that they're going to get.
Gotcha.
So, okay. So if they don't think that they are going to get any return, then the value of that asset that the debt is based on will fall. And if that becomes a generalized issue, then you have a financial collapse.
Okay, well, I mean, doesn't this take us then quite nicely to political power? Because couldn't that be one way to like quite dramatically force regime change then? If you could implement degrowth and kind of trigger because this is a lot of what they talk about as well, degrowth scholars, like it's either degrowth, a controlled degrowth, or an uncontrolled financial collapse. So couldn't that then force a change in the financial system whereby this old kind of, this historic evil of like making money off of money is no longer possible for investors or rich nations?
So I'm going to take some different parts of that in turn. So let's start with the controlled degrowth. But I'm not going to use the term degrowth because I don't think it makes sense, right? We need to implement emergency plans to transform some things very fast. And those are the highest order things within the world system. So that is most importantly energy, food production, and debt write-downs. Those are the things, and there are other things as well, but those are some of the most important things that we need to have emergency plans that we can then follow for rapid transformation. Now, we might be talking, using different terms for the same thing. I'm sure there are some degrowth scholars that would, agree with that, and I would agree with their things. I'm not trying to diss people that do and good things. But
of course,
how do you move things out of the academy to reality, to social reality, and into power? So then the question is, how do you develop the power to deliver these emergency plans and do so at the national, the transnational, and the international levels, which all seems balmy. The term that I'm knocking around at the moment for something which isn't a Green New Deal or degrowth is a Green Democratic Revolution, which has the green because we need to have ecological transformation. The democratic because democracy is basically the most radical thing, full stop, which is why they've tried to make it mean something that it doesn't mean. So I'm just going to take a small detour here for a second. So Antonio Guterres, the UN General Secretary, has clearly been reading a lot of climate science, and the guy is shit scared because he's just sitting there all day. He's reading the climate science. He's then looking at the social system and going, oh my God, we're not doing anything. Oh my God, we're not doing anything. And every single time he's able to put out a press release that's going to get coverage, it all goes, come on. And he had one, I think last year or earlier this year, whatever. And he said, I won't do a Portuguese accent. He said, we're on the highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. And he's completely right. Apart from one thing, right? We don't have our foot in the accelerator. We are tied up and gagged and bound in the boot of the car, and the ruling class are driving it. So it's not just a question of like, we need to collectively come together and take our foot off the accelerator and maybe change course a bit, et cetera, et cetera. Like we have to find a way to cooperate, to untie ourselves and each other, burst to really extend this metaphor in a really tortured way, burst through the back seat, force the driver out of the driving seat of the moving car, learn how to drive, and not drive off the cliff, which is extremely close. And maybe that's not technically possible. Maybe the propulsion of the car is too, we're too close to the edge, and the car is already moving too quickly. Who knows? But that's what democracy is. Democracy is not parliament. Democracy is certainly not the US system, which is set up explicitly to be anti-democratic. It's how do we insulate the system from popular power, popular control. So the only way in which we can actually deliver these emergency plans would be through having a democratic economy and a democratic politics. A democratic economy means large-scale planning of the most important elements of it, and that is a revolution, which is why you have revolution in the term, because it's a political change, it's a social change, but also, and I think this is important in the kind of what the left posture is to to system breakdown, which we're experiencing, has to be anti-regime. And let me explain it, because otherwise the anti-regime forces go to the hard right. And if the left tucks in behind as the left wing of the management state, which is trying to technocratically limit the catastrophe of breakdown, we'll never get popular schools. That's basically, I mean, we've tested this recently, because that's basically what happened with COVID. With COVID, the hard right went, no science, no nothing, right? And the left went, it should be very sensible, and basically let's listen to what the government say. And tucked in behind is like the left edge of the administrative state. And of course, politically, that's very bad, because who's benefited politically from COVID? I mean, you've had a massive expansion of the hard right in huge numbers of countries, and in British politics, for example, that's the coming force. The trend scenario is we'll have a really crap Labour government, and the hard right will be the main pole of opposition to it. Trump coming back, the Bolsonarismo is hardly over, Modi is unbelievably popular, blah, 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 blah. Yes, so that I've forgotten what I was saying, but I think what I was saying was that our posture as well has to be like totally anti-systemic. We're not coming in to try to get some reforms to try to ameliorate just some of the crises, because it's actually not possible from where we are in the system. The things that the choices that progressive forces had to make, let's say 50, 60 years ago, where the system still has a lot of expansion, a lot of road left to run with it in it, saying, well, look, if we get involved at this point, we can improve the bargaining position of this group and that group, we can ameliorate this crisis, we can resolve that. By crisis, I mean normal functioning crisis. This one and that one, we can improve these conditions, we'll change the social settlement this amount. Where we are now, so close to full-blown systemic breakdown, we don't really get that much for it.
A green democratic revolution. I think this is so interesting, right? Because obviously, I mean, one of the main issues with there's so many bloody issues with politics today. I mean, the fact that it's national when we have international corporations and a planetary crisis, for one. But it is so difficult to get people excited about politics, because they've sort of seen through the two-party system now, where it's just like the same thing over and over and over and over again. So you have to offer something new. But I think what's quite difficult for the left, or for like really like a progressive revolution, is that if you take that kind of thinking to its logical end, I mean, it's essentially, you kind of end up at like, why don't we just abolish the whole thing? You kind of end up at anarchy, right? Where like communities have a sense of sovereignty and they get to make decisions for themselves and they get to take care of each other and all this kind of thing. Whereas, so like the logical progression of really progressive leftists, like thrusting thinking, is kind of the undoing of the tool itself in order to sort of break through into like, a new world order or whatever. Whereas the right, it's kind of the doubling down of the thing. It's constantly making itself a firmer force, right? It's kind of like the difference between like a womanist sphere. Yeah. And like the womb allows for like new things to grow. It is life-giving by its very emptiness. Whereas the spear, I mean, that thing will kill you. Like this is the difficulty with that kind of thinking, I think, as well now. Let alone the forces that exist to try and undermine and impeach and torture and twist that kind of ideology. And I mean, you'll know this better than most, given you were in the heart of the Corbyn campaign and saw him getting taken down by the right-wing nut jobs, allegedly, on the inside of the Labour Party.
Well, there's a lot there.
Pick any bit.
So to start at the beginning, most people quite rationally don't follow politics, don't believe in it, and so on and so forth, because they're smart and we're stupid. If we follow politics, we're basically stupid, because we, as you know, you get all these supposedly intelligent people on the internet being like, oh, he'll do nice things when he gets in. No, Labour will. No, they will. They won't. They're being clever, because actually, if you don't promise you'll do anything good, then you'll do things good or whatever, right? Okay. I mean, you need an advanced degree to be that stupid. Most people, most people are not that dumb. And the changes that we need to make to our political system go well beyond like having a better party in, changing who some of the MPs are, and so on and so forth, because it is structurally set up to insulate the ruling class from popular pressure. And you see this, I mean, it's painful. I worked in Parliament for, I guess, about 4 years for Corbyn and for Labour. And you can see it all the time. It's unbelievably painful. We look at all of our institutions. The Bank of England is set up so that a massive chunk of macroeconomic policy, which affects how much money people have, it's outside of political contestation, right? Which they're like, oh, it's good, technocrats will do it, which means no, the elite consensus will take over, and the elite consensus doesn't care what's in the interest of ordinary people, which is why they decide against the interests of ordinary people at every conceivable possible juncture. Yeah. The broader political system also functions in that way through lobbyists, through the revolving door between the top levels of the civil service and the corporate sector, and that's why you get the outcomes that you get. And under normal times, things that the overwhelming majority of people support are not on the political agenda, which is why the idea that there is a centre in politics is a complete fiction. The centre does not exist. It's constructed like the centre is just the moderate midpoint between the right and the left. No, the centre is elite consensus opinion. That's it. And an elite consensus opinion is almost always massively in the minority. And so you have to work very hard to prevent things which are massively in the majority from getting political expression. So, you look at polling, and between 2/3 and 3/4 of people support, including, generally speaking, the majority of people who voted Tory in the last election, support things like public ownership of energy, water, rail, mail, so on and so forth. They support a £15 an hour minimum wage. They support a wealth tax. All of these things which are considered way on the left. They're not on the left. That's actually the centre, right? If you're talking about where is the mainstream British public opinion, and it's such strong public opinion because no one ever says it in the public sphere, and when they do, they are ridiculed. So you have all of the communicative apparatus of civil society, particularly the media, but also think tanks and so on and so forth, saying, oh, all this nice stuff that you want, you can't have it. Oh, what you want to have a nursery place for your kids so you can work and also have a kid. No, can't have it. Oh, you think you don't think there should be a tax loophole so Rishi Sunak pays a lower rate of tax than you and me? Sorry, can't do it. No, and there's no politician that's going to speak in favour. So this is also what I mean with how progressive forces need to be properly anti-systemic. It's not like we want to be junior partners within that system, because you get swallowed up. And the reason, now just to say one more thing based on the Corbyn stuff, the reason why Corbyn had to be defeated and destroyed, and now since then basically erased from the history books as anything other than this horrific aberration. It's because Corbyn was a horrific aberration from the perspective of elite consensus opinion, because you had an alternative that was put forward, which people could go for. Now, of course, there are many things that we did wrong. There are many structural failures. There are many limitations from the Corbyn project. But fundamentally, it put forward an alternative which, for a huge chunk of the population, is common sense, and therefore it must be expunged in favour of, let's take water. Public ownership of water is like 75% plus popularity, right? It's so obvious. And yet Labour are plotting with the privatised water companies, according to a leaked email from I think it's the boss of Severn Trent Water Company, to allow them to keep in private hands, but through it's a public interest company, or some other technocratic fix. I don't really know how much I didn't really answer your question. I just sort of went on 3 different rants that intersected slightly, but
that's fine, because I said 3. My own had 3 different rants. I think that's totally fine. I suppose let's leave the kind of like metaphysical womb versus spirit thing aside, because that we could probably talk about that for hours. And let's go back to focusing on like these forces that exist to undermine popular power, and maintain the ruling class. I mean, how do we have, given the media is controlled by the ruling class as well, given that we don't have control over the narrative, therefore, given that it's very difficult to get access to power because power coalesces in such a way as to ensure that anyone who is entering into it is going to play by the rules. Given that we had that kind of like once in a lifetime aberration, Corbyn, who lost, and given as well that the revolution needs to be global, because you cannot have sort of a popular revolt in one country that won't then be taken down by the global capitalist regime in some way, CIA. How do we have a green democratic revolution? How do we organize a green democratic revolution? And also, how do we reclaim the word revolution? Because a lot of work has been put into undermining that as well as something that's dangerous and kills people and never actually works.
Oh, well, I'll start with 2 extremely optimistic points, right? The first is, my God, they have to work so hard. They have to work so hard. They have all of the money and all of the power, and still everyone fucking hates them, and no one thinks the system works well.
Yep.
Right? So, let's not get totally like, people are just happy going along. They're eating their soma. It's Brave New World. No, it's not. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for most people. And even when they have full spectrum control over the media, saying, this is bad and this is bad and this is bad and this is stupid, the common sense of the country is social democratic, left social democratic, even on lots of policy issues. Where the media is really effective is where it has a concentrated hate campaign against a particular group of people or people. Then it can really change public opinion, and that's, of course, that's an objective force that we have to compete with. But in general terms, they're not doing terribly well. The other optimistic thing to say is, yeah, sure, transformation has to happen ultimately at the global level, but everything starts somewhere, and each thing that happens can encourage the next thing to happen, and generally speaking, that is how change does take place. It happens in one place, then rapidly in some other places. It may get defeated in the first place, but it's had profound effects in other countries. Was it Emmanuel Wallerstein? Someone made the point that the French Revolution happened in Denmark. It's like, from the point of view of 50 years after the French Revolution, you've got the monarchy back and blah, blah, blah. And someone's like, yeah, but, most of the things that they fought for in the French Revolution, they have in Denmark. They didn't before the French Revolution, right? Now, then they did. So, those are some basic optimistic things. Now to get into and therefore, let's not be defeatist about it. Like, they are not running the system well, and people can see that. Right? We think that we're doing worse than we are because we spend what we tend to hear is the media. We don't tend to hear what people think. So you hear someone who seems like they're the voice of normality on the media saying, "Oh no, couldn't do that." Right? That's not actually a normal person. That's someone who is there because they will fulfill the role of appearing like a normal person who believes that thing. Everything, not everything, but a very large amount of what we see and hear is formed by selection bias. Have you seen the amazing interview from years ago with what's he called, Andrew Morris interviewing
Chomsky? Yes,
and he says, Andrew Morris sort of says in an incredibly pompous way, journalists, we're a stroppy, disputatious lot. How are you saying people are telling us what to think? And Chomsky says, no, I'm not telling you. Anyone's told you what to think. What I'm saying is that if you thought something different, you wouldn't be sitting opposite me now asking me the questions. And that's how, that's how it functions. So we shouldn't, as people who are active for radical social change, environmental, whatever we want to call it, we shouldn't internalize that too much and think that that the actors are actually reality because they're really, because they're not. So now, practically what can we do? And it's, of course, it's going to be different in different national contexts for obvious reasons, but those do need to add up. So there are some commonalities. So the first thing I was saying was have a fully anti-systemic posture, right? So let's take Spain, for example. Podemos basically has got swallowed up by, and I've got lots of friends in Podemos, lots of respect for them and also for Sumar, the new left force afterwards, work with them, great. But they have been swallowed up into, the left part of the bloc that fights against the right-wing bloc. And that's a necessary role that they're playing, but the next force needs to sit outside of that. So that's one thing. Next thing is uniting different types of struggles into a social majority with one line of antagonism, one line of attack against the people that are in power. And that needs to be our line of antagonism. So we need to find things and issues and events that people care about that brings together the big social blocks that we have. So people as workers, people as women, people as disabled, people as racialized, and so on and so forth, into having a united front. And then when there has that united front, it needs to have a radical democratic element. Extremely radical democratic element, as in, this is not just we're changing some of the people that are at the top of the state. We have to go in to democratize the state, which means that we can then democratize the economy. So that means building democratic institutions that can manage the economy and have a popular participation within them. For example, like small thing, but for example, there should be a day a year, which is tax day, where everyone does their taxes, which should be a national holiday, but also it should be participatory economic planning day, where you say, I think we should spend more money on this and less money on that, and we should do this, blah, 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 blah. And that can be an aggregation of what people want, which then gets fed into what comes out. There needs to be hugely, at every single conceivable level, more democratic participation, not only because it will yield far more progressive outcomes, but it is also far harder to attack. It is so much easier to say, oh, that Jeremy Corbyn bloke, what a bastard, than it is to say, wealth taxes are bad. And then it's one step even more difficult to say, Yeah, I don't care that the majority of people have just come up with and said that that they want wealth tax for this reason. The majority of people are bastards. It's just a really weak argument. It's really hard to demon. It's that the majority is much harder to demonize than something which can be polarized around. Exactly as you were saying earlier. How do you stop something being seen left so they're polarized without losing its identity? Normally when the people are saying that, they want you to merge into some ridiculous, mushy, let's all hold hands with Rory Stewart and, basically flop into the elite consensus thing, but from a kind of nicer. And that's not wrong. It's a very hard line, an extremely hard militant line, because we need to go back to the incredibly tortured Antonio Guterres inspired car and cliff analogy. They do be really forced out of the seat. Really forced out. And, we're nice people, so we'll probably just tie them up and put them in the boot rather than throw them out of the moving car, because we're nice, right? But they have to be pulled out of the seats and stop driving the car.
Okay. I want to pause you here then and ask, not just based on this metaphor, but can we get there without violence?
So violence is not the thing that will most likely bring forward a social majority for power.
Mm-hmm.
But that social majority for power will be met with violence necessarily.
Yes.
Which is, even if we set up a really nice democratic system where people choose democratically to have a fairer distribution of wealth, power, and opportunity, which is what people would choose, that is taking away wealth and power from a small number of people who have it, who also have tremendous access to violence. And so violence therefore will come, but it will come as it already has. The system relies on a tremendous amount of violence to maintain itself. At every single level. I mean, of course, at the geopolitical level, to secure access to resources, the overthrow of governments, but also the policing of workers in mines and so on and so forth. And even in societies in the global north, if you look at types of employment related to security have also increased quite a lot in the last 30 years. More people whose job it is to either mete out, respond to, or in some way negotiate with violence has increased in societies in the global north. So, I mean, the system is not like those that wish to change the distribution of power in the system are the violent intrusion into the system. System normal, part of the crisis of system normal is the meeting out of violence. So yeah, I do think to go back to the nub of your question, we have to be clear-headed about the fact that if you are going to take away things from the people who have the most wealth and power in the world and the greatest access to violence, they will mobilize that. The question is not morally, but strategically, what is the best response? And if they have all the guns, probably standing there with your little pistol is not the best. It's probably not the best response. That's not because standing there with your little pistol is some moral deficiency, and if they're being violent, we can't beat it with anything like that. It's just, well, if they've got the guns, you've got to find it. You've got to find the terrain to fight on, and the terrain to fight on isn't going to be who's got the most warships.
Yes. But also, I mean, even before that, right? Before we get to a point of like taking away, even being able to enter onto the terrain, even being able to begin the fight. And I love the French word is déclencher, like trigger, how, because there's so much talk, right, in the movement around violence and non-violence, and how, oh no, it's non-violent movements that are always the best way and always create a better system. And then obviously Andreas Malm wrote Our Bloc pipeline and said there is no such thing as a non-violent revolution. The moderate flank is always supported by a radical flank, essentially, which allows for the moderate flank to be invited to the table. And we do sort of seem to be tied up in like moral knots at the moment around, are we really going to let the end of the world happen at the hands of just a very, very small number of people because we are unwilling to fight on that terrain, essentially. So even before it comes to a stage of, like, say, the ruling class putting up a fight against what we wish to take away, because undoubtedly they would. But how do we even get to the stage where we have the right, maybe not the might, the political might to begin that fight as well? And will that sort of be forced to be violent? I mean, how long do we wait to see that we are not being listened to?
So to answer your two questions in one, well, hopefully in one way, the debate between violence, non-violence, reform and revolution, whatever, those are debates that tend to happen when basically nothing's going on, right? Like, we don't have agency, we don't have a campaign, we don't have a thing which is challenging power, so we can have the abstract discussions, right? When we do have agency, we have a vehicle, we have a project which is doing something, then we won't really be having those debates, because it's going to be incredibly shaped by contingency and by what's in front of us and what's there. And again, to be optimistic looking at the frailties of the existing system, like, they don't have this on lock. They really, really do. Like, Corbyn wasn't meant to take charge of I'm not saying that there's going to be a new Corbyn in the Labour Party, but like, the Labour Party was a threat to the capitalist class 100 years ago. It did make substantial social reforms in the interest of the overwhelming majority of people 70 years ago. And it has, over time, been trained into a kind of more of a kind of house pet party, a plan B for the ruling class. You know, they've got their A team, they've got their party, the Tories, and the Tories rule, and then eventually they really suck so bad that even within our anti-democratic system, they're going to get chucked out. So they give you plan B. Right, and plan B comes in, and yes, okay, fine, they have to give some reforms and we get some stuff out of it. But that's the basic structure. But even within that system, it is sort of most, in 2015, after whatever we had by that point, 35 years of neoliberalism, falling trade union membership, all of the objective things not looking good, Corbyn is able to win. Why? Because they changed the electoral system within the party. Why did they do that? Because one Labour MP punched a Tory MP in a bar and it caused a by-election. Like, there's like a random chain of events that leads to this opportunity. And the reason there's an opportunity is because they're constantly having to fight hard to put, what's the right metaphor? I'm terrible with metaphors, as we're now learning. But, it's like its hands are pushing down against water and it's still squirting through. It's finding there's huge pressure that's building up and they're trying to hold it down. And we don't know exactly how, out of which knuckle gap, there's going to be a spurt, but there is going to be one. And the job through whichever one it comes through is going to be the same strategically, but it'll be in a different location. So it'll have to act differently and it'll be based on its contingencies. But it needs to challenge the system as a whole. It needs to unite different elements, different bits of society that make up the supermajority, but that form different places, as I'm saying, workers, women, racialized, etc., into a common front to make a democratic assault. And then what that democratic assault is looks different in different, in different contexts. Yeah. Some of those might be quite traditional. Some of them, like the Corbyn one was pretty traditional. We tried to go through the first past the post electoral system to elect a better prime minister. Right? That was the model. Pretty simple, pretty traditional. There might be other ones. In some countries that really works. In others, of course, you can't do that. And then it's the agglomeration of those revolts and those mutinies. And particularly important is uniting the what should be a generalized mutiny in the South the global south against the system as it is, against the specific mutinies in the north. I mean, if we're talking about agency and who has agency, who has the need to change things, 150 years ago, as workers of the world unite, you've got nothing to lose but your chains. If you follow that same logic, it's the workers and peasants of the global south whose land is going to be further exploited for minerals, whose labor is exploited for the extraction of those minerals and also for industrial production based on it, who are going to have huge so-called surplus populations that will be shunted aside, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's potentially tremendous revolutionary agency there, but very disaggregated, of course. And that's part of the necessary work, is uniting people divided by geography, language, issue, against common enemies, because we do have common enemies, and those common enemies, going back to the old metaphor, they're in the driving seat and they're driving us off a cliff. They're driving themselves off a cliff as well, but they can't help that.
Yeah,
they're going to do anyway. And if saying, please don't do this, look, we have this nice science man, he's got this nice coat on, he's got all the graphs, he can really show you, please take your foot off it. They can't take their foot off it. They won't. No, and the existing system at the macroist level is unreformable. We have seen that with climate breakdown. Didn't have to be. Margaret Thatcher understood the climate breakdown was happening and thought that it could be managed because they were able to deal with the ozone layer problem. The difference is free radical capital. The destruction of the ozone layer is caused by free radicals interacting with the ozone layer and therefore dissolving it. Right? Free radical capital wasn't that important. So you can just say, piss off, free radical capital, you're causing us all problems. Go away, you're ruining the party. And they go away. And then the ozone layer grows back and you've dealt with the environmental problem and you can carry on the system as normal. Right? Fossil capital is not like free radical capital. So you can't just do that. We've tested that to destruction now for more than 30 years. But we see it with everything else, debt crises, the so-called, the system that is meant to manage development and debt for southern countries only works to further exploit them. While Sri Lanka is going through its terrible debt crisis, it's still paying the IMF money. Yeah. Ukraine at war is still paying back the IMF. Clearly that, and as we were saying beforehand, in the year 2000, there was a debt write-off for some heavily indebted poor countries, as that was what the acronym was. And a lot of those are back in debt because that's how the system operates. Or take COVID. In COVID, we had the technical capacity and the manufacturing capacity to inoculate the entire world in 1 year with COVID vaccine. With COVID vaccines, which were almost entirely produced with public money and public research. Mm-hmm. And we didn't because instead we followed some intellectual property laws which could be waived, and there were provisions in the WTO in order to waive them, and yet that didn't happen. So we have tested to destruction the theory that if we give better information to those in charge about how terrible things are, they will realize that in their own interest and the interest of everyone else that we need to change course. We've tested that. That doesn't work.
Yeah. To be honest, it makes me think, to really extend that metaphor, it makes me think that if we ever got to the stage where we ripped open that driver's door, it would just be a driverless car. Everyone's in the fucking back seat. There's some idiots that think they're driving.
Yeah.
And who are all talking about the fact that they're driving it. Yeah, they're in the trussed up in the back seat doing this with the wheel as if they're driving.
Well, someone needs to learn computing fast then, because cars are made of plastic and computers now. So
Yeah. How do you? I'm sure they have a handbrake. I'm sure they still have a handbrake.
Yeah, they've got to still have a handbrake.
they got to have a handbrake. I suppose the great thing about that is like you can kind of at least take everybody out of the car and let it go over the cliff. I'm going to stop there with that metaphor. Otherwise, I'm going to get confused and I'm going to ruin it for everyone. I already ruined it. That was such a nice little like punchline. Like we open the door and it's a driverless car. I shouldn't have taken it any further. Damn it. James, this has been really, really great. I love how you've kept hitting the same points over and over and over again about what needs to happen, why it needs to happen, and how to do it. Thank you. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I really like Richard Seymour, who is a British, well, it's actually from Northern Ireland, so I don't know if he is technically British. Anyway, that bit doesn't matter. He lives in London. He is a writer, eco-socialist, who writes also a lot on the rise of fascism, contemporary fascism, the psychology around mass support for the hard right, and lots on eco-socialism stuff, and he's very good.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.